Um, Thank you very much indeed for this opportunity to talk to you all, and very appreciative of all the time that people are giving in considering this. It's often a lonely place to be worrying about people's digital rights, so I'm very appreciative of the attention that this has provoked. Um, I'm here speaking on behalf of Digital Rights Ireland. I'm actually their solicitor from McGarr Solicitors. I've represented them for about 12 years. And I'm speaking jointly with ICCL for the purposes of our discussion here, because we've really written a joint um, submission to you. And I don't intend to try and reproduce the contents of an 8-page submission for you. Yeah, everyone's perfectly capable of reading it themselves. And really, what I wanted to do in terms of this sort of spoken word section is to give you a sense of kind of three areas that I think it might be useful, sort of tools in your toolbox as you're going through all the rest of the presentations and you're listening to the other speakers. So we probably have a different viewpoint to many of the speakers that you hear, though I hope you'll see that we intend that it be complementary, not oppositional. Um, First of all, to really address why is it that we're having a jury on on using medical data. We're doing this because medical data is a sensitive piece of information in relation to the individual, and it is increasingly over the last sort of 10 to 20 years, it has been seen as being part of the global push towards respecting the individual's rights to their data. This is what you'll have heard of referred to as data protection. Um, but that's a reflection of a sort of a 40-year push to recognize that information about human beings is inherently part of their sort of penumbra of human dignity. So we've seen a couple of examples of that in the last couple of years in Ireland alone. I think probably the most recent flashpoint on that was the tension between the government and between adopted people and people who had been through the mother and baby home system. And there, what we saw was an institutional approach to human dignity clashing with that individual human dignity approach of the GDPR. Now, in Ireland, what we have done with this is that we've followed the EU rules, where we're a signatory to the treaty, and so we respect the rules. And that means that we have a set of guidelines that we use in all cases that we apply when we want to process data to ensure that we respect the local rules, which is the Data Protection Act, and the regulations that come out of that, but also the European rules, which overrule the local rules if there's any conflict between them. With the EU law is superior. And above that, again, is the Irish Constitution and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And the Charter of Fundamental Rights places at a constitutional level respect for people's privacy, but also respect for their data protection as a brand new human right, the most recent human right minted since World War II. So you'll see that we're dealing with this in a kind of an international context, and our conversations should always bear in mind that legal framework. It's not there to get in the way, it's there to make sure that the individual is put at the heart of decision making and that individual rights are not lost sight of at any stage. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was, can you do health research and can you access health data under the GDPR? I mean, I do remember an occasion where early on in the GDPR, there was a live line devoted to people ringing up, telling stories about how they wanted to get a certain piece of information, but the people on the other side said, "I can't give it to you. The GDPR won't let me." The one that sticks in my mind was the lady who rang up her hairdressers and says, "I wonder if you could tell me which dye you were using on my hair." And they said, "No, we can't do that. As GDPR won't let us." So frequently, what we see is GDPR being used as kind of the new health and safety. It's the catch-all excuse for institutions not to do things not that they don't want to do. But in reality, there are lots of ways in which the GDPR not only permits health research, but actually specifically accounts for it because it's recognized as a matter of public good. And as we sit here in the middle of a pandemic, talking into screens with our own faces on them, I think we'll all recognize that it's in everyone's interests, and everyone recognizes that it's in everyone's interests that health research be permitted. The only thing that I would say is that GDPR requires is that the research is done in a way that requires that individual to be put at the heart of it. But it doesn't require what we'll frequently see people saying you have to have consent. Consent is only one of the legal bases that you can process health data under Article 9 of the GDPR. So, yes, you can ask for consent directly, and provided you give the necessary information, you can get consent. But also, and in addition, there are other areas as well as consent that you can rely on to process data. You can rely on Article 9(1), and you can say, I need to process this data as part of a public health system. Now, that's not the same as research, because obviously that's about clinical delivery of clinical health services. But nonetheless, it doesn't rely on health, and that's very important because on consent rather, and that's very important because if I'm knocked down tomorrow and you put me in an ambulance and whisk me to A&E, I absolutely do not want people to be shouting in my ear, do you give consent for us to operate on you? I want you to operate on me. And the GDPR recognizes that is permitted and in fact allowed for under the provisions of the Act. The other thing is,
Simon, just to let you know that you're over 6.5 minutes in, just if you want
that's okay, because we'll wrap up very quickly. And the other thing is that you can also do it for the purposes of having a health delivery system, but you must have a law that allows for that one. Now, the final thing I was going to touch on was, what is personal data? You should be watching out as you're reading all of the documents and from ourselves and from other people. There is anonymized data and there is personal data. And anything that isn't fully anonymized, no matter what kind of usage of language that it uses, whether they call it de-identified data or pseudonymized data, you should recognize that under the Breyer case from the Court of Justice, it's still personal data and has all the same protections as personal data. So it's either anonymized or it's personal data. And it doesn't matter what has been done to the data, if it isn't anonymized, it's still personal data. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And Olga, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Simon. And just to reiterate what Simon said earlier, thanks a million for having us here today, and hello to everyone. I'll try to keep it quick because I know we've gone over time, but one of the questions that you were all being asked is who should be able to access, share, and use your health information, both identifiable and non-identifiable, and for what purpose? And we would suggest that you should maybe flip that question when you're considering it, and answer, because answering the second part of the question first about the purpose of sharing the data, you will be able to probably ascertain who should be able to access and share that data and when that sharing should occur. Like the legal basis for processing data is purpose-based and not identity-based. A lot of the commentary and material that we have been provided with very helpfully, the case studies of, let's say, John and Margaret, Patrick, Ruth, Jane and Peter, they're all seemingly identity-based in terms of what's possibly acceptable and what's possibly unacceptable. But instead of maybe asking yourself who should have access to A, B, and C, you should be asking yourself, what is the purpose of someone or some people getting, taking, examining, collecting, i.e. processing the very personal and sensitive data that is belonged to another person? What is the purpose of that process? And then ask yourself, is the data that is proposed to be collected the minimum required to meet that purpose? Is there a chance that the data collected is more than what is required for that purpose? And then you should consider the principles of necessity and proportionality. Because the processing of personal data, such as highly sensitive as medical or health data, engages fundamental rights such as the right to the protection of personal data and the right to privacy, the processing of personal data, which by its nature limits those rights, must be strictly necessary. And then after necessity, considering the principle of necessity, you must consider the principle of proportionality. And this means, like, are the advantages of limiting those rights to the protection of data and privacy, do they outweigh, they must not outweigh the the disadvantage is to exercise that right. So the limitation must be proportional to be justified. Like nobody should be using a sledgehammer to crack a nut effectively. Even when good and valuable work is being carried out, we have a process for that to ensure that it is done in a way that is compliant with data protection and privacy laws and principles. And then this brings me back to the earlier point that this should not be about who you are in terms of who gets to access other people's personal data, but what is the purpose? What do you want to do with that data, and what is the purpose of the processing? As Simon pointed out, we do have laws. We have a system that privileges people really on foot of humanity and not on foot of professional qualifications. Everyone in this Zoom room has equal rights and protections in the law, and really these are based on humanity and equality, and they should be respected at all times. In relation to the other question, are there provisions which would increase your trust and confidence in different stakeholders accessing, sharing, and using your health information? As we said in our handout, trust and confidence can really only come from valid, informed consent. I know Simon touched on consent being one of the legal bases, but it can really only be informed on foot of full and transparent descriptions of processing. So transparency, is also key in this regard. So someone giving consent for one purpose doesn't mean for another purpose. And I know I'm running out of time, but I suppose just to say the reason that we're here in this topic is because the reason that we're engaged with this process is because the topic is so important. And we've attempted to show in our handout, by way of listed examples, how this can go very, very wrong when personal data is not respected. So getting this process wrong has genuine clinical and social consequences for people. So if I could just finish with one quote from Dr. Ben Goldacre, the British physician and academic, in light of the scandal, the care.data scandal that's in the handout. He said, this breaks my heart. I love big medical data sets. I work on them in my day job, and I can think of 100 life-saving uses for better ones, but patients' medical records contain secrets and we owe them our highest protection.